I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Pour It Over. And, it's a little trippy for me to be sitting here with John Ganz and his new book, When the Clock Broke, which is out in paperback now. But I remember a lot of this stuff firsthand. I was old enough to remember it. I was old enough to participate in it. And here we are. So part of the conversation we're going to have today is a little bit about how history is always alive and staring you in the face. And wow, I'm slightly older than I think maybe I was prepared to be. But that said, John Ganz co-hosts the podcast Unclear and Present Danger with Jamel Bowie. And if you're not listening to that, I cannot recommend it enough. It is one of my regular listens. He's also a columnist for The Nation and has a Substack called, wait for it, Unpopular Front. John, I'm really happy to see you. Thank you for making the time.
Oh, yeah. Thanks so much for having me, Miwa.
So here's the thing. I think I have a couple of maybe decades on you. And I'm just wondering how you came to the 90s. I mean, When the Clock Broke, Con Men, Conspiracists, and How America Cracked Up in the early 1990s. You, I think, were in elementary school, possibly, when all of this was going down.
I think I may have actually been in kindergarten when some of it was
great.
going down.
Okay, here we go.
Well, but yes, I have very vague, some of my earliest political memories are actually dealt with in the book, but it wasn't kind of a nostalgia project that immediately drew me to this. My interest in this time period originated due to my interest in understanding the election of 2016. At this time, everyone was wondering, this is a huge change election. This figure came out of not nowhere, obviously very famous, right, but upset a lot of political conventional wisdom to become president. A lot of people were looking around to understand these things. I happened upon, while doing research, an essay or an article by a libertarian economist from late 1991 called Right-Wing Populism. And he was reflecting on David Duke's failed campaign to become governor of Louisiana in 1991. And he looked at it and as your listeners may know, David Duke was once a Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan and a neo-Nazi. And he did not win the election, but he did quite well, particularly with white voters. And Murray Rothbard kind of saw a model of right-wing populism in David Duke's run, and he later applied it to his friend and someone who he advised, Pat Buchanan. Mm-hmm. So this article started the whole research project, and then finding that essay, and that turned into an article for a magazine called The Baffler, which was about the election of 1992. Yep. And that expanded into looking at that year as a moment where this kind of anti-establishment populist politics, particularly on the right, but a little bit on the left too, started to break out and had a moment, and then kind of was not exactly forgotten, but definitely papered over a little bit by the Clinton years. Another big figure in my book is Ross Perot, who became a kind of a punchline, and we remember as a kind of humorous figure, but looked really like he had a real shot to become president that year, and had the biggest third party percentage of the vote since Teddy Roosevelt. So, not an election that a lot of people thought, election year that people think of as historical realignment, like say 1968 or 1980. Right. Or Barack Obama's win, or 2016 for that matter. But I thought underneath, if you scratch the surface a little bit, there was a lot of very interesting political things going on that had been kind of forgotten.
The first time I read the book was right before it came out in hardcover, and I flew through the galley because it was so wild for me to see all of this in one place. Because again, when you're reading the papers, right, and at the time we had, Time Magazine and Newsweek, podcasts were not a thing yet, but there was a lot of radio coverage. I mean, it was just, we experienced the media in a different way. So to have it sort of all laid out in a single narrative for me, I was just like, oh, right. There was a lot of it, turning to my partner and saying, do you remember? And both of us kind of going, oh. I mean, we were out of school at that point, but it felt like Bill Clinton had sort of come out of nowhere. And here, of course, is George Bush Sr., being his sort of very patrician self, feeling much more Connecticut than Texas kind of thing. And then Ross Perot, everyone's kind of looking at his ears, but he was a very serious candidate and really came out of a business background. It was a really strange experience. And also this was right after Bush had run against Dukakis, and that was kind of a whole routing
Yeah.
there. I also just remember the adults around me talking about the election in very strange ways. They were just all kind of trying to figure out what it meant. And so to meet you and have you coming from just an entirely historical perspective, my eyes are kind of crossing a little bit. I'm like, how did this all possibly happen in this span of time, right? I mean,
yeah, I mean, election years are crazy,
right?
And it takes once you go back and look at the record, the historical record, read the newspapers, watch the footage from TV, listen to the radio clips. There's an enormous amount going on. Obviously, every single individual only is aware of or consumes a little bit of that. But then, when you remember the time, and hopefully if you do a good job as a historian, and I have some memories, but obviously I was a small child.
Right.
Hopefully if you do a good job as a historian, it kind of brings back, it can recall what it felt like to exist in that time. Although it's important that you don't totally do that, because there's a big difference between memory and history. And that's a problem, is that everyone has a memory of a certain era, and then it's kind of a historian's job to say, hey, our memories of that era are tendentious or distorted, or, they've become subject to popular interpretations, and we got to rethink those popular interpretations by looking at what actually happened. So there's a little bit of a conflict between history and memory, because memory is more fluid and subject to revision. And history tries to base things in documents and facts. With that being said, hopefully to someone who lived through the era, it doesn't read as totally alien. It kind of says, hey, oh yeah, this kind of what it was felt like to be in this time. So that's definitely an intention. But yeah, as you were saying about Bush, as a figure, it's a type of Republican that really doesn't exist anymore very much. Is a country club establishment Republican from a very old waspy patrician family, going back, to the Mayflower and to early America. And they weren't, and he was already a bit of an outlier in his era, because the conservative movement and Ronald Reagan had really taken over the Republican Party. And Bush moves rightwards to kind of be a part of this and to accommodate himself to it. But he comes from a different era of being a Republican. So he reaches 1992, and he finds, as he called it a weird year, as you kind of remember. And this explosion of populist energy, the growth of new media like talk shows, which were radio talk shows, which were first being mass syndicated. Cable was sort of new on the scene. It had grown in the 80s, but it was a bigger part of cable TV news and panel shows and discussions. Daytime TV shows like Donahue, these became part of the public sphere. And Bush was not a politician that was accustomed to dealing with those things, and he wasn't really ready for it. Bill Clinton was a little bit more ready for it. But the politicians that really kind of mastered it or showed where this could really break with the media mainstream's hold on all these things were these kind of populist insurgencies like Ross Perot, like Pat Buchanan, like David Duke, which showed that the subject, the media is manipulative, but it can also be manipulated, particularly if someone is a very good or compelling story. So, yeah, you have a moment where the old way of, and this is why I thought it was, so interesting to look at now, or in the era of Trump, is like the old era of doing things was beginning to show cracks, and it kind of recoalesced. Obviously, a lot of the negative media coverage of Ross Perot. Ross Perot was fantastically popular for a short period of time. Looked like he might beat both the other candidates. Then, a drip of negative media stories, and his behavior on screen starts to look a little nutty. And it does hurt his approval numbers. He doesn't have the internet yet. He doesn't have social media yet where he can completely go around the media. And that's what I was talking about at the beginning. Rothbard's essay that inspired me to write the article and then the book was saying we need a populist short circuit where we can go around the media elites and we can go around, the bureaucrats in Washington and kind of create our own reality and create our own political reality. And so that begins to appear, and the book kind of tries to chronicle that. But it's still very much in the old era. And I actually think that makes it, in fact, I know it's a lot of information, the book, but I think kind of easier to consume because it's old media. It's almost like a slow motion version of what the world is like today because it's still not social media, TikTok videos, Twitter, where everything is just, so compressed and moving so fast. It's still kind of going at an older pace, but you can see, oh, okay, well, if we accelerate this hundreds of times and intensify this hundreds of times, what it would be like. So it's almost like seeing an earlier version that's a little slower and maybe allows people to wrap their minds around it more easily.
I mean, it's definitely slower, yes, but at the same time, like, part of it is all of this talk radio was shocking at the time.
Yeah.
Like, it was because people would call in and they would be very blunt in their feelings. And, Rush Limbaugh was suddenly, this guy who was everywhere, who was on the cover of every magazine. He was, being interviewed on other people's shows. And radio was a thing that, your parents had the radio on in the car or like, there was background noise somewhere. But radio became a different thing. And the amount of advertising dollars that suddenly got plunged into it. Like suddenly AM radio wasn't just the thing where you listen to like the local baseball game and the weather and the farm report. It was, and this is pre-Sinclair buying lots of smaller television and radio stations and deregulation in that front. But suddenly it felt like it kind of came out of nowhere. And it felt like propriety had been kicked to the curb a little bit. I mean, and certainly now we have podcasts where you're like, oh yeah, well, it's the Wild West. People just say whatever they're going to say. But at the time, it was kind of like, there was a lot of pearl clutching. I will be, that was the equivalent. And the same thing with those TV shows too. I mean, Jerry Springer, like former mayor of some city in Ohio, but also
Cincinnati.
People would throw chairs and there were a lot of fraternities. It was, I mean, no one had ever really seen anything like this. And it was on at like 3:00 in the afternoon.
Yeah, I know. When you watch it when you're homesick from school.
Completely wild.
Yeah, it was a different side of America was being showed and a lot of, it's easy. And I, to your point about pearl clutching. Yeah. I mean, compared to today, it might seem tame or quaint, but I think people were disturbed because they were seeing things on TV and on the radio that was very aggressive, very crude, did not paint humanity and it's in the nicest light, was anti-establishment, showed in some ways I think were positive, showed different sides of the American experience in some ways that may have been negative. But it was a shock to the system that all this was kind of beneath the surface in American life. And there was an audience for it. And there was an audience that craved it and wanted to interact with it, that it wasn't just a one-way street. Obviously you had call-ins to radio and people really enthusiastically took to that. And you had the audience in the studio audience on TV shows, which was, a participant and cheering and kind of voting with their voices on it. So yeah, it was democracy. And there was a lot of talk at the time about talk show democracy. So it was just another time of another part of American democracy expressing itself. And things sort of came out of and people realized Americans are a lot angrier than they thought.
Yeah,
they're a lot more lonely. They're a lot more confused. American life was kind of wild, and it burst into view. People were talking about, as you mentioned, fraternity suits, affairs, all kinds of scandalous behavior, which obviously doesn't rise to the level of criminality, but was being kind of tried by the public in these talk shows. And there was a bit of it that was voyeuristic and prurient, being like, oh, we're watching these people's lives fall apart. And a bit about it, like the country was sort of legislating and deciding, is this okay? Is this not okay? How much do we understand these people? How much are we judging these people? And there was a mix of extremely judgmental behavior and probably a little bit of empathy or understanding for people in difficult circumstances, to be frank. I mean, how was it? Much good did it do? I don't know. But I definitely think it took a lot of experiences people were having out of the dark and put it in public. And, then people could judge for themselves others. And that's sort of what we do in a democracy. Everybody's kind of legislating for each other all the time. So yeah, it kind of expanded American democracy. It also made it possible for the public to be manipulated too, though, because very, very charismatic figures or very sensational issues could come on and sort of take over the public imagination and maybe distract people from more substantive, more thoughtful, more reality-based things and get people to focus on scandals or very emotionally hot-button issues that were not, good for people deliberating clearly about what we should do as a country. But now this is just a fact of life. I mean, everyone's
Right.
emotions and thoughts are on constant display, being judged, commented on. This was just, a very miniature version of that beginning. So yeah, you kind of see little bits and pieces of the social media era beginning to be born in these earlier forms of media. Yeah.
Did you surprise yourself though? I mean, you're coming at this from, straight up research and a little bit of Like, do you get surprised though? I mean, you're working backwards from a really wild moment in our history and trying to find the roots of the thing, and you have an idea and you've got this original essay. And I remember when Duke was running for governor and people were, again, kind of like, oh, this will never happen. And I'm standing there outside of Boston saying, well, do you remember when adults threw bricks at buses full of children who were being sent to school? Like, are you kidding me? So the idea that somehow this could not happen in a civilized society, I was like, but, okay. But again, you're coming from it like from a purely historical standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I found surprising were the parallels. I mean, there were just so many and so many kind of uncanny ones. But in a way, that's not surprising because everything has origin points and everything has precedents. Like they get repressed or forgotten, but there's a reason why things are, and they become, they take final shape or a more definite shape. But there's always a origin or a history behind almost everything that we see. Things don't come out of nowhere. So, it's somewhat surprising or interesting or rewarding part of doing historical research, and hopefully when people read it, to find those things. But, it is basically, like it feels surprising to rediscover because, we've lost them in collective memory, but it shouldn't be because obviously things don't come out of nowhere. I think that's kind of the joy or what's so intellectually stimulating about both reading and doing history is those moments of recognition, which you say to yourself, well, this was a previous society. It's still, but I can still recognize that these people were coping with many of the same issues, had many of the same solutions, or experimenting with many of the same solutions, and you realize it makes you feel less. I mean, it gives your time some context and makes you feel less unmoored to just be like, oh yeah, this is part of a continuous story, a narrative. Others have dealt with similar issues. There's a continuum here. It's not just things appearing out of nowhere. So yeah, I think that I was surprised, but I think that hopefully the experience is illuminating. Sometimes the illuminations are surprising because you don't expect what you find. But then I think what it should do is to make the world. I think sometimes surprising things are disorienting, and I hope that it makes you feel more at home in the world and able to understand it a little bit more, not more confused. So yeah, I would say some of the close parallels I sometimes found a little bit surprising.
I love hearing you say that because one of the reasons I like to read history is to give context and sort of, the further we get away from the Vietnam War and like having to explain Vietnam to younger people, where I'm like, so we did some stuff, or like explaining America's role in Central America and Latin America and how we, basically created a migrant crisis now with the choices that we made as a government years ago is it's a little wild watching folks connect the dots when you're handing over the context. But the way I describe the 90s, usually to people who are younger than me, is like, we were barbarians. We were just total barbarians. I mean, just the way we approached everything, just the misogyny, all of it, like we were just complete barbarians. So to see it laid out on the page in a way where it's like, oh yeah, we did that. Oh, yeah, that was considered just average behavior. It's
yeah, there is some of that. But you know what? There's also opposite feelings.
Okay.
Sometimes I would say, sure, we live in a more civilized time where there's more sensitivity around certain issues that back then people were very insensitive about or very aggressive or violent about, sadistic even. But, also that process has created a backlash, and there are things today that we see and things the way people talk that were seem to be on their way out and now are back. And also I think that the way public discourse happened and journalism happened was not necessarily worse than it is now. I mean, some of those talk shows, as we were talking about, were quite something, but reading old newspapers, especially when there was great local news, you see things that you kind of miss. There was also, some very good programs on TV and radio. So I think it's a little bit of both. It's like I recognize that, there's more consensus about certain issues being serious and other things, and the way that they were treated glibly or cruelly. There is a shock of, yeah, that's really bad. But to be frank, sometimes, the new era feels like, oh, well, previous times felt a little bit more civilized, and people are more aggressive, sadistic, willing to be extremely hostile in the realm of politics, engage in rhetoric that's shocking, coming out of, I grew up in this period and I was small, but by the end of the decade, I was aware of politics, and it was partisan and it was confrontational. But, a lot of the things that happen in politics today and the rhetoric that's used in politics today would be unacceptably shocking still at this time, even though I'm charting kind of the growth of certain things.
Right.
And now it's just like, well, anything goes. And also, not to mention behavior that's illegal, quasi-illegal, unconstitutional. Like, these would have created larger scandals, and now they seem to be accelerating at such a rate. So, yeah, I mean, I understand it that, especially in pop culture, you see things where, oh, you're like, I can't believe people just like did not make a big deal out of that. That seems so crude or so nasty today. But, in other ways, it's like, hey, the way people conducted themselves in public was a little more civil, and perhaps that was covering up things. Perhaps that wasn't always a good thing. Perhaps that was dishonest or hypocritical. But I would say it's a mix. You see old norms fall away, and you look back and you say, hey, was that really the worst? And then you would see other things and you look back and you kind of cringe and you say, damn, I can't believe people were so brutal, as you put it. But I would say it's a mixture. And in some ways, it when I did the research, I'm shocked, but I see it as a more innocent time in other ways. I mean, I'm constantly, as I'm aging, seeing things today where I'm like, that's not sure how you're supposed to act. Yeah.
I mean, I think it was possible too in the 90s to still be scandalized. And now does scandal even exist anymore? Like, is that even a thing? It feels like question. Culturally, it doesn't even exist anymore. And to a certain extent, sure, a society should evolve, language should evolve, culture should evolve. But I feel like we started to make some real progress, and then suddenly the brakes got thrown up at a couple of different points, right? In response to, this is too much change. And part of me is thinking, but how is this too much? This doesn't feel like too much change. So watching this sort of push me, pull me happening at the same time where I'm like, oh, wait a minute. It's like you were talking about patterns, right? Like there's stuff that you see in this pivotal 92 year that you're writing about. And it's like history lifted these moments exactly and just put new names, slightly changed circumstances. And it's Arthur Schlesinger and the cycles of American history, right? It's just as much as we think we are moving forward. The Venn diagram things get a little too close for comfort. And I think that just comes back to how humans move in the world and how power works.
The question of progress in history is a tough one. I mean, like, look, today we've certainly, in many parts of the world, seem to have made some progress in living together in peaceful ways. And obviously in other parts of the world, there's a lot of violence. Right. And violence seems to be increasing. It's extremely difficult to say, civilized behavior has won out. I don't know. Maybe there's some kind of basic quantum of human aggression that just kind of moves around, and that's not a historical question, that's an anthropological or psychological one about, what kind of creatures human beings are. I think that basically in any era, you see signs, you see institutions and behaviors that are praiseworthy and noble, and you see other ones that are really blameworthy and shameful. And, part of history, part of the interest also in reading history is just to look at things that possibilities lost, where you're like, you know what? The hopes envisioned by these people, the ideas that they represented, which couldn't have come true at that time, were worthy and shouldn't have been forgotten. And other things you say, that was really a product of its time, and it's best that we've moved beyond it. Would I say American society? I mean, it also changes day by day. I mean, some days, it's very difficult to tell, until the history of the time is written. And then there's just debates between historians of what the defining characteristic of a time period really was. The 20th century, a lot of people in America are nostalgic for the 20th century. Understandably, there was a lot of prosperity in this country in the second half of the 20th century. Although in the world, the 20th century may have been the worst century ever in terms of wars, genocide, famine, human suffering on an untold scale. So you have enormous technological progress, huge degrees of people being lifted out of poverty, industrialization, electrification. The world is changing in all these ways. At the same time, you had, these horrible wars, depression, so on and so forth. What is the story of the 20th century? Is it one or the other? It's difficult to say. If you have an optimistic point of view or a pessimistic point of view, you're inclined to one or the other. Is humanity tending towards barbarity? I don't think you can say one way or the other. I think, in the moment for many people, it does not look particularly encouraging. Hostility and a lot of violence, war. American politics obviously seems extremely truculent, and older ways of being in public look quaint. But as you mentioned, like you look back in the 90s and then you suddenly say, like, I can't believe people didn't spoke this way or behave this way, or that was just de rigueur. And a lot of the things that we now take for granted were first becoming issues in the 90s, and issues around gender, around sexuality, the debates, the discussions, the new sensitivities to them, and in some cases, the insensitivities to them were, and that's another thing that I thought was very interesting about doing the research for the book is like, oh, this is when this kind of entered into the public consciousness, and people are first grasping with it. Like, and it creates, sometimes people say, this is making me uncomfortable. I want to go back, regress to the earlier way of doing things. And some people say, no, we have a new way of living in society. So I don't know. It's very hard to say. I mean, and it's going to take a very long time to write the history of our era.
Which I also do want to read. Even though I'm living through it again.
It'll take 30 years maybe before.
Yeah, I can be patient, and the women in my family live a really long time, so I'm planning on being around to read those books.
Glad to hear that.
But also partially thinking too, I mean, the way we process information, like the 90s also feel like sort of the last gasp of monoculture, right? Like you could argue that we don't really start to splinter. There's sort of pre and post 9/11, right? Let's use 2001, because really social starts to ramp up between 01 and 05. And reality TV actually starts to take off sort of between 2000 and 2008. Like, so the early aughts are a whole different, like, that's another book that I'm waiting to read as well. But the 90s that we're looking at right now, it's kind of like, like in some ways the behavior was less shocking because we had monoculture. And in other ways, you noticed when someone diverted, right? So like someone throws a chair on a Jerry Springer episode, and I'm just using this as an example, and, pearls are clutched everywhere because who throws chairs in public? None of this behavior is new, though. You read a novel and it's like, oh, right, people have been thinking about this, for 10,000 years. It's just the delivery mechanism changes, right? So there is that direct line from like, the scandalous Hearst papers of the early 19th century, right? Where it's like everyone's making stuff up and like the Yeti came down and all of this stuff. It's just insanity. But you can see how we get from like, you know, the tabloid press and sort of P.T. Barnum and Tammany Hall and all of this kind of craziness, right? To
Yeah.
a mass merchandising of political culture that now has been exacerbated by social and deregulation. I mean, we can't ignore deregulation in the role of all of this.
Well, deregulation was a huge role in the spread of talk radio, which my book discusses, and cable. Yeah, there was a bit of a monoculture. There was more television shows that everybody watched, radio shows that mostly everybody watched. But again, that's fragmenting because there are political subcultures that are kind of entering the mainstream. Like, you know, Rush Limbaugh is not everybody's cup of tea, but he has a mass following, you know? He is not the same as Friends or Seinfeld. It's a different way of viewing the world. It's not something everybody watches or enjoys. It's an oppositional media. It's a critique or a criticism of the world, a particularly harsh one. And it gets a mass following. So you begin to see negativity towards other social groups. I mean, this has always been the case a little bit, but really you see, oh, wow, there are a lot of people out there who have negative feelings towards themselves, towards others. And there's a mass following for media that plays on that. You know, obviously the media always scapegoats, targets. There's a degree of aggression in coverage and the way media, you know, that's the way a democracy works. There's scrutiny, there's coverage, and that kind of, you know, tinges into character assassination and destruction and humiliation on some points. And then we say, well, that's a public figure. That's part of the game they play, right? But again, this is the way we I think another thing I want to think about people to think about when I read the book is like, democracy is not just going to vote. Like, we're constantly kind of practicing democracy. And especially in the social media age, that's become exacerbated. So when you call in to a talk show and you give your opinion and your judgment of things, you're participating in a weird way. And everyone says, oh, well, it's kind of a joke. It's kind of entertainment, but you're participating in democratic life. So this sharing of opinions, which can be harsh and can be destructive and can be mean, is part of democracy. And like, you know, you see, and that people's sympathies go in different ways. And you see figures who, you know, you or I might revile and would prefer to see destroyed by the press. And other people see the same process and say, I identify with that person and I find their process of destruction to be personally disturbing and I want to support them. And you see that, especially in Perot's campaign, where at first the aggressive press coverage of him gets him a lot of sympathy, you know? Like, people say, why are they being nasty to this guy? I like this guy. You know, I sympathize with him. He seems like my kind of guy. And this is a pattern that plays out now all the time, which is, you know, basically everyone is a politician, a democratic politician, small d democratic, where, you know, everybody's behavior is subject to judgment and consensus. And now you have micro influencers having these dramas, and those are being legislated by their publics. People saying, expressing their opinions. Is this acceptable behavior? Is that unacceptable behavior? So this drama of democracy, which takes place in the media and in films and on TV, you know, like, is a constant presence of our lives and is very anxiety producing. And people deal with that anxiety in different ways. Sometimes they want to see a scapegoat destroyed. Sometimes they want to see somebody rescued or rehabilitated from public destruction to feel okay. So this drama begins to play itself out, and now I think is really part of everybody's life.
I want to come back to something you just said a second ago about, you know, playing out too in television and movies as well, because you are the co-host of a show that I think does a great job actually connecting current affairs and history, but you do it through 90s action movies, which if anyone has ever, like, you guys have a wild slate, you and Jamel Bowie. And I do.
Oh, yeah.
It is actually a useful tool. I have recommended the show a million times to people where I'm like, if you kind of really need to understand how wild the world was in the 90s, start here. Because there are plenty of people who've seen either, you know, snippets of a Wesley Snipes movie or whatever. Like, how did Unclear and Present Danger come about? Because I feel like your work everything you do is in conversation with sort of figuring out how we fit in the world, we being Americans in general, like how we fit in the world and how we may or may not have evolved.
Yeah. Well, Jamel and I are both, Jamel being my podcast co-host, who's also a columnist at the Times and a writer, I admired for a long time. And we became friendly through Twitter. And we both realized that we kind of had a shared love of films. And we were looking around for a subject of podcast, and we were both talking about the kind of political thrillers of the 90s. And, you know, it's a time when America has succeeded, is victorious in the Cold War, and doesn't really have a global rival yet. So it feels good about themselves, but it's kind of unsure of where to go next. So we picked up on that kind of uncertainty in the movies about a country figuring itself out. And when we use the films to kind of talk about history and then talk about where we've ended up now. So we talk about the political context of the movies. We talk about the movies, what they say about different fantasies people have about American politics, about America's role in the world, what America should do, what American politicians, the American military should do, what the American military is capable of, not capable of, bureaucrats, politicians, just this kind of whole imaginary world, which is also connected very deeply with the way people shape the real world, about American politics and society in these films. So, you know, this project has been going on for a few years, and we're making our way through the decade, and a lot of people seem to really like it. You know, we thought it was going to be kind of a niche thing, other people with sort of nerdy interests like ours, but again, in the era of fractured culture, you just find out that there are a lot of people who share your interests. So yeah, we have a wonderful community. We have a Patreon where the community comes on and chats with us, and people, and I meet people and they are really into it, and I'm always really pleasantly surprised by that, because I thought it was kind of me and Jamel's niche project, but people have responded really well to it. And yeah, I think it's really a fun way to do history, which is a little bit of culture, a little bit of politics, seeing how they meet. Obviously, there's an entertainment factor because we're watching movies. It's a good guide to movies of the 90s, which some of them are mediocre. Some of them are great. I mean, that was a great time for films. So yeah, no, we've been going strong for like 3 years now, 4 years now.
I really like using pop culture as a lens. I think it makes things less. It's not so much that it takes the formality out of it. I'm not asking people to study the world around them as if they are getting a graduate degree in history or political science or anything like that. It feels like a fun, interesting way to participate in what's happening and be able to layer in context to the world around you. And if you happen to be using a Harrison Ford movie or a Gene Hackman movie, or Wesley Snipes made a lot of movies in the 90s, and I feel like you guys have covered a lot of them.
Huge star.
He was the biggest movie star. It was wild. But the idea that our art is intersecting with our culture at any given moment, I think. And so I called action movies from the 90s art, but it's movie making.
It is.
Like, people intentionally went out into the world with a story, and either we got does the world need to see Tommy Lee Jones in a chicken suit? Not really, but was it funny? Sure. Is it still funny? Sure. But yeah, he probably doesn't need to remember that he was in a chicken suit in U.S. Marshals, but whatever. But the idea that we can take any piece of art and turn it around and be like, so what do I get out of this? Like, what does this mean, right? Like Bill Clinton playing the saxophone on Arsenio Hall's TV show, like that was a big pop culture moment. And I'd forgotten Arsenio Hall had a talk show. Right? Joan Rivers had a talk show. I mean, so many people had talk shows.
Jesse Jackson had a talk show.
Right. And that's what the medium was. And it's just like,
Yeah. I think especially in retrospect, the meaning, people kind of consume those things and, they wash over people. They may shape the way they think about things. But I think especially in retrospect, you're able to go back and kind of understand what the different component parts of that of those moments were, and say, oh, that was actually like kind of a big deal, and everyone kind of laughed at it or was upset about it, but then you realize, oh yeah, there were many different kind of forces or factors leading into these things. And you go back to a film, a Hollywood movie. Hollywood is popular art, and it reflects what people think is what's on people's minds, and they want to hear it, and often it is, and the movies are big hits, or in some cases flops. So Yeah, popular art is important because it reflects more than anything. It reflects and shapes more than anything else, the imagination of the public. And it deserves, I mean, you can overthink it to the point where it's no longer fun. And I sympathize with people who don't like that tendency. But I think, it's worth, if you like to think about the world you live in, it's, those things are worth reading too. I mean, it's just, if you enjoy reading, you can kind of read films and read old TV in the same way and say, oh, yeah, I have a different interpretation, or I'm going to come up with an interpretation of that. And I mean, obviously, coming up with interpretations of things is a lot of fun, and everybody likes to do it. And it's a fun to exchange those. That's just what, thinking is and reading is.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I think it's an important process of understanding the world you're living in. I mean, you can also overdo it. I mean,
Right.
I think, but I think the reason we don't take ourselves, I think the reason why the show is successful, and I think people seem to enjoy my writing, is that you also don't want to take yourself too seriously. You want to kind of be like, okay, when at the end of the day, we're talking about a Hollywood movie here. We can enjoy it. We can understand that this doesn't require a doctoral dissertation to interpret. A few words, a few choice words on it may be enough to kind of get it and offer a new perspective to people. But yeah, not everything needs to be torn to absolute bits or analyzed in minutia. Sometimes, just an interesting remark on. I mean, that's what criticism used to do in the newspapers, and that's sort of unfortunately dying. But maybe with podcasts and with YouTube, there's a different form of commentary. It's like, yeah, like to appreciate what's going on in the culture around you. It's nice to read criticism, or it's nice to read what people are thinking and talking about things. And then you have conversations with others that maybe are a little more substantive and not just, I liked this or I didn't like this. It's a little about like, why do we like this? Why do, like I think it enriches your life.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they're going to be too much too. Trust me. I like to just throw on these movies and not to think about them. It was very nice to consume media that's just sort of joyfully thoughtless and also I think you can have both. You can have things that are smart and entertaining, and that's really the best of all possible worlds, is when you can kind of get both.
Which we get in When the Clock Broke.
Well,
we
I'm
totally
very glad
get
you
that.
think so.
Yeah, no.
Yeah.
It is such excellent fun. But I do want to talk about literary influences too, because I mean, of course, we're running along on time, but clearly you've been reading a lot. Your sensibilities are not just informed by screen stuff or,
No.
all of this kind. So I just want to talk about you as a reader for a second and some of the influences because I mean, there's a little bit of Hunter Thompson happening in any of us of a certain, like anyone who's followed sort of in those footsteps.
Yeah.
Like you've had that happen. And I'm not saying you're a direct descendant of, but there is a little bit of that like raised eyebrow sensibility happening in When the Clock Broke. So literary influences?
Yeah, I mean, like, so not exactly Hunter Thompson but that era of new journalists, obviously, like with Didion and with Gary Wills, influenced anybody who wants to write about politics in a creative way. And then kind of a generation or two after them, I mean, Rick Perlstein is a big, who wrote Nixonland, and The Gathering Storm is a huge influence on me and what I did. And my book would not be possible without him. He's actually a kind of a friend and mentor, so big influence on me. Yeah, I really enjoy, George Orwell. Criticism and essays, a huge influence on me. Christopher Hitchens, when I was growing up, was a big influence on me. And then, people that they read and kind of turned me on to, people like, for novelists, Saul Bellow, people kind of mixed high and low sensibilities. Yeah, so it's a mixture of different writers. And I try to read widely, omnivorously, and just kind of like go where my interest, I kind of get obsessively interested in a certain time period, read everything I can about it, or a certain author, read everything about it, and then I kind of let it go, and it kind of marinates in the back of my head. Yeah, I mean, the whole generation of New York intellectuals, Edmund Wilson, Hannah Arendt, Mary McCarthy, that sensibility of writers is something I always really admired and wanted to emulate. So yeah, there's just all these kind of wonderful figures in the past that I idealize, and probably a little too much. Although, as you get older, you can kind of see the faults in their writing or their approach. But yeah, those stylists, those writers are always with me, hopefully. And obviously, like, you know, when you read, you kind of read with an eye to learn the tricks of a writer. You
Yeah.
see the way they construct sentences that does interesting things. You see the way that they make arguments. You see the way that word choice, and there's two things going. The wonderful thing about reading is it sort of calls upon all your senses. So you're reading the word and you're hearing the language, and it all is also calling on your imagination. So there's imagery. And the best writers have the capacity to activate both, which is that the sentences are very beautiful to listen to, and they also generate very powerful imagery. So when I read writers, I always am like, how does it sound in the ear?
Mm-hmm.
Is the sentence sound good in the ear? The rhythms and everything of it, and
Yeah.
does it create powerful images? And or is it just I can hear this person's voice really clearly
Yeah.
conversationally? That's another fun thing to read, is that I can feel like I'm in the room with this person. I think when you read a really great book, and I think this happens in fiction a lot more than nonfiction, is that the narrator's voice kind of stays with you. You start
Mm-hmm.
to kind of experience the world through the narrator's voice,
Mm-hmm.
and you kind of narrate the world in their voice. And I think that that's sort of, yeah, that as a writer, I think is really rewarding, is when you start to say, okay, I'm going to learn this person's tricks. I'm going to start to emulate them. I'm going to get what they do. How is it that they make their sentences so good? How is
Right.
it do that? And sometimes it's a little bit beyond your capability, and you kind of just have to wonder at it and say, wow, that's really remarkable. I don't exactly know how they did that, but then you can kind of do a little analysis, and you say, why is that? Why is this person such a good writer? Oh, they have really great rhythm in their sentences, or they have amazing kind of alliteration, or and you notice these things, and then you try to steal little bits and pieces of it, and that's basically how you become a writer.
God, John, that seems like the best place to end. I mean, this is how we get here, right? Like we pay attention to what's
Yeah.
happening around us, we read our history, and we find cool ways to make connections. So thank you so much for joining us on Poured Over.
Thank you so much for having me. This was great.
Hello, readers. It's time for another TBR Top Off. We're going to recommend a couple of great books to pick up when you stop in for your copy of When the Clock Broke. I'm Mark at my Barnes & Noble in Cincinnati, and I'm joined today by my book buddy Donald in Detroit. Hello, Donald. How are you?
I'm good, Mark. Hello, everybody.
So I'm going to go ahead and kick things off. I was thinking about books that zero in on societal benchmarks that have lasting effects on what we feel and experience today. And it brought me to the very, very wonderful Heather Cox Richardson. You may know her from her newsletter, Letters from an American, where she connects current moments to those of our nation's past in very profound ways. One of her earlier books, though, is the one I want to talk about, and that is West from Appomattox, The Reconstruction of America After the Civil War. Now, seems like a pretty far away time period to sort of think about things today, but trust me, Richardson threads the needle well. Just like When the Clock Broke, I think this book dives into details of a societal shift that really resonates now. So Richardson pulls some of the Civil War aftermath focus slightly away from the South, where most research and topics are usually found, and really zooms out more to explain how the North and the West partnered with the South to establish a really firm national identity and work towards becoming the world power that the United States wanted to be and is today. I think the book does a very good job of covering that time period between Lincoln and Theodore Roosevelt's presidency in a way that resonates now, and how those many factors and players built America's Reconstruction. Richardson is an excellent author. Everything she touches is pretty fantastic, but also definitely read her Letters from an American. So good. And the book is, again, West from Appomattox, The Reconstruction of America After the Civil War. Donald, what do you have for us?
So, Mark, that's a great choice. I think that's a great companion to When the Clock Broke. I went a little bit closer to the same time period, but I'll tell you what's really fascinating about your book, the book we're talking about, and then my book, and then just times in general, of how much really never changes. And all of the interesting, quirky, individual stories that pop up in different decades, if you really look at them as these big, giant time capsules of a year, you're like, wow, that's not really that different from what we've just dealt with ourselves. So the book I picked is by Rick Perlstein. It's called Reaganland. And it's actually the third part of a very loose trilogy that started with Nixonland and then The Invisible Bridge. But this particular book really deals with, Reagan becoming, our president. It kind of starts in the late 70s, but moves definitely into the 80s very quickly. Deals with, his political future, but his comeback was fueled by an extraordinary confluence of major events that happened during the 80s. Things like the New Right started happening, gay rights, feminism, militant crusades, again, against people's rights. Civil War broke out in the Democratic Party. Even Jimmy Carter plays a little bit of a role in this huge story. But there's also, a storyline in there about a serial killer, how the media takes their approach to world events and, local and foreign affairs. I mean, you look at these things, and it's really quite fascinating. And then, regenerizing the conservative Republican base in Reaganland. And Reagan ran on the campaign slogan, "Make America Great Again." So when you think about like Reaganland and how far away that was, what we're dealing with today, When the Clock Broke, the book you were talking about and recommending, it's a great way if you're really looking to learn how we continue to make the same mistakes, but yet we do inch our way forward a little bit. And these are all great examples of how these collective individual things that are happening in our world really are one big picture. And so again, the book that I was talking about was Reaganland by Rick Perlstein.
Excellent. Yeah, I totally agree. I think that looking back at our past to inform our present and look towards the future and take not just the darker pieces, but the hopeful pieces as well. So thank you. Excellent. But that's all the time we have for today. Thanks so much for tuning in to Poured Over. Please make sure to give us a rating and subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. You can also follow us on our socials at Barnes & Noble. I'm Mark. You can follow my home store at BN Westchester. Donald, where can we find you?
You can follow me at BN Northville.
All right, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Happy reading. Bye.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.